It's late October in 1994. By this point, we know that Mark Andreessen has come and gone from EIT. Netscape is up and running. So the foundations of the new World Wide Web have been constructed. But there's one major thing that has not been sorted out if the World Wide Web is going to become the World Wide Web we know today: security. So Tim Berners-Lee, who by this point was at MIT, gathered some of the biggest minds to his office to hammer out some solutions. And let's just say it wasn't pretty. Tim declined to comment. So the story begins with our fast-talking and tangent-loving friend, Alan Schiffman.
We were already in sort of the kitchen cabinet for security. I don't mean for everything Berners-Lee was doing, but he wanted the W3C to be more relevant for security. By the time SHTTP had come out and the first IETF drafts had already been published and was being circulated by the RC editor, I'm not saying that we were done, but we had our first implementation. We had code that was shipping, and we had an internet draft, and it was published.
Okay.
And so in that sense, we were well on our way.
Alan, what is with all of the acronyms? So just to translate Alan's tech speak, W3C means the World Wide Web Consortium, basically a governing body for the web started by Tim Berners-Lee. IETF means Internet Engineering Task Force, another standards organization. RFC is an acronym you heard in Season 1, meaning Request for Comment. Basically, a publication detailing any number of technical things. And SHTTP means Secure Hypertext Transfer Protocol. This is the reason Alan is all fired up. SHTTP was the code Alan and EIT were working on to encrypt the transfer of information sent over the internet. This would allow users to do something as unimaginable as paying for something online by entering your credit card info on a website. Making transactions secure online was essential to scaling one of EIT's many dreams of bringing e-commerce to the masses.
And then it turns out there was a guy at Netscape who had a completely different approach. And Tim called me and said, would you like to come to Cambridge to talk about Netscape's going to present a security protocol? And I knew nothing about it at all.
Remember, this is just a few months after Mark had quit EIT to start Netscape. He had tried to poach some of EIT's employees, and the company had to send him a cease and desist. Now he's back in a meeting with Alan at MIT.
So I show up. There's Mark, and there's Tim, and there's Philippe Hallenbaker, who is the guy in charge of security, works at W3C. He's the guy in charge of security, and he and I talk all the time. And Mark, right? 4 of us. There might be a 5th. I don't know, maybe there's somebody recording this stuff.
Tim Berners-Lee, Mark, Alan, maybe someone else, and Philip Hallenbaker in a room. Baker was an EU fellow at CERN at the time and had started working with W3C. Mark was showing them Netscape's SSL, or Secure Socket Layer Protocol. This protocol was a direct competitor to EIT's SHTTP.
So anyway, Mark goes to the board and starts describing this not message-oriented protocol. I know that's a technical detail, but it turns out to be quite significant. And he went to the whiteboard and drew the packets.
And Mark makes his presentation, and what is the resolution from that meeting?
He was laughed out of the room.
Who laughed him out of the room?
Well, I'm saying collectively. I don't know that Tim laughed. That's sort of strong words. But yeah, Philippe and I, we were speaking simultaneously or alternating words. They made this obvious boner error. Crucial to the protocol, it's not like a typo. The whole core of the protocol was to do a certain thing, and they didn't understand that that was trivial to break.
Netscape, which was quickly becoming a superpower in Silicon Valley, had basically screwed up something in their protocol that made it easy to break.
Basically, after we broke the scheme that he said was unbreakable, he became rather quiet and didn't say much more. Spent some time trying to desperately call up Kip on his phone. Kip Hinckley was the guy who was the named author of SSL.
That's Philip Hallenbaker, who is explaining to us how Mark tried to call Kip Hickman. Kip was a protege of Jim Clark at Silicon Graphics.
Mark wasn't allowed to work on SSL directly because of the non-compete with EIT. He was on gardening leave. He wasn't allowed to work on security. So I was talking to Alan rather than talking to Mark because, he'd made this proposal. Obviously, we assumed that he would want to move to one of the proposals by the people who actually knew how to write code rather than continue with his thing.
You would think getting laughed out of the room by your professional peers would be the end of Mark's SSL protocol. But if we've learned anything about Mark Andreessen, is that he's pretty unstoppable. This was just the start of yet another protocol war. In this episode, we're going to get into all of the back and forth over internet security and why that matters to us today. This is Computer Freaks from Inc. I'm Christine Hani Dare-Bryan. Chapter 3, Bad Blood. Here's what you need to understand about the state of the web by 1994. Thanks to the work of companies like EIT, consumers and businesses were starting to see the economic potential of the internet. But
very quickly, they started to realize that it was a real problem that the web had essentially no security layer at all.
That is Eric Rescorla talking. He worked with Alan Schiffman on security issues at EIT months before Alan headed to MIT to debate them with people like Tim and Mark.
So many of the things you wanted to do, and in particular, I think it's a very broad term, but really stands in for e-commerce in this sort of first generation, were of real concern on the web. Do people want to send their credit cards over an unencrypted internet connection? And, the internet was a new technology, and I think people were very keenly aware of of the security properties. And because of the design of the internet versus the telephony network, I think it was much more obvious how insecure it was, even though the telephony network was actually not very secure. The motivating concern for the work that I saw being done was, what will the credit card issuers and networks think about our ability to do transactions over the internet? Will they accept a card not present transaction when the card number was sent over the internet?
I met with Eric at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California. As an aside, the museum is actually located in the old Silicon Graphics office building. Eric was another young, talented engineer EIT had recruited. Eric is the guy who figures out these security questions with Alan. So once again, I'm going to throw a bunch of Alan jargon at you. This was the moment when our computer freaks were thinking about all of the things that could go wrong with online commerce and how they could prevent them. It's incredibly technical, but so important to the way we live and shop today. So listen out for these 4 words: cryptography, confidentiality, authenticity, and integrity.
So we need to have a general security protocol so that message traffic, including the request, right, and the response, would be protected by cryptography so that you would get the important ingredients, which are first confidentiality, namely only the people who are parties to the traffic should be able to read it, right? Authenticity, namely you could be certain that the sender is who he says he is and the recipient is who he says he is. And integrity, namely that the message received is the one that was intended to be sent. So we needed to design a protocol that would make the minimum amount of damage to HTTP, because there were already HTTP being the web protocol. So we wanted to have a drop-in protocol that would add cryptographic protection to messages that were sent over the web.
So let's break down what Alan just said in terms of real shopping today. When I'm ordering something online, I can thank the computer freaks for keeping my order confidential. I can also thank them for trying to figure out how, when I place an order, that somebody verifies it's actually me placing the order. They also figured out how to confirm that the code reads the correct order I place and sends it to the company. This is the same exact problem Netscape was trying to solve with SSL. But as we know from the start of this episode, SSL had some issues. It seemed like SHTTP was winning this protocol war in October 1994 when the MIT meeting happened. And Alan and Eric knew it. Here is Jeff Treuhaft, one of Netscape's employees working on SSL. He had the unfortunate pleasure of presenting SSL at yet another meeting shortly after Mark was laughed off the MIT campus by Tim Berners-Lee, Philip Hallam-Baker, and Alan. Alan, now joined by Eric, doubled down even more on SSL this time.
So I think the first time I met Alan and Eric, I was unprepared. They're both very smart guys. And I was showing up at a meeting that had Apple representatives, and I don't know if the Microsoft guy was in the room for this one. It was a local one here in the Bay Area. And I was given a 15-minute window to kind of present SSL to the group, technically. And these were architects and people that had fairly technical backgrounds, engineering backgrounds. And I didn't single anyone out. I didn't single Alan and Eric out from any of the other people that were in the meeting that day. But I quickly realized what we were in for, because about 3 minutes into my presentation, Alan and Eric started just trying to poke holes in what I was presenting. So I was kind of up there on my own. I didn't have an engineer behind me who could argue with me the way Alan and Eric were teaming. And what I recall is that they kind of went a little too far, and some of the other OEMs that were in the room, I guess maybe felt sorry for me that I was getting darts thrown at me so hard so quickly. And so they started defending me and like, hey, let him speak, let him finish, that kind of stuff. But that was my first taste that this was not a skirmish. This was going to be much more difficult than that.
To me, Jeff seems like a pretty reasonable guy. So I asked Alan why he picked on Jeff. What were you thinking?
They just thought that security was like another engineering problem. Get a book, read a couple pages, and now you can write software. I sometimes say that your opponent in the world of engineering is typically Murphy. He does things at random. He doesn't actually try to screw you. It just happens by accident. Most of the time when you have bugs, almost all the time, it's because you were stupid, not because somebody was out to get you. But security is different because there's somebody out to get you. They don't just attack their strong points, they look for your weak points. With bugs, you might only have bugs in parts of your code that handle cases that almost never happen. So that's why a lot of bugs might be dormant in ordinary code for years. But security bugs, you have some bad guy that's looking for stuff. They just thought it was another engineering problem at Netscape. And they put one amateur after another to design it, think about it, and it would enrage me and Eric and all the other security people. They just didn't respect the difference of writing security code. For a year, they just didn't take security seriously. And so it was all trivially breakable. Every time they made a change, they would do it wrong, and they would learn a lesson and then not know the next 500 lessons. But I don't want to tell you that this was a permanent state of affairs. It was not. They woke up one day. I don't know where that could have happened at the top. I don't know. Maybe they got tired of getting beaten up.
Netscape certainly did wake up. The protocol war was far from over. Before we dive into the next battle in the protocol war, let's talk about another battle Netscape was fighting in 1994. It was between Mark's new company and NCSA. You may remember that's where he worked as part of the team that built the Mosaic browser. Here is Kim Stevenson, who is one of the professional full-time programmers at NCSA.
When Netscape was trying to get themselves going, they wanted to call the company Mosaic Communications Corporation, MCC. And so there was legal issues between that, and they came to a compromise. Netscape would become Netscape instead of Mosaic Communications Corp, and we weren't allowed to talk about it. So there was those of us who still worked for the university, and the university itself were not allowed to dispute any of the mythology coming out of Netscape about the history of how things started, which was the beginning of how those of us who kind of got written out of history got written out.
So that was then, but you're able to speak now because...
I don't work for the university anymore. I never signed it. It was an agreement between the University of Illinois and Netscape. Netscape doesn't exist anymore. So I feel like it's okay for me to tell the truth. They wrote me out. It's fine for them to take credit for the things that they did, but don't take away the work that we did.
This dispute doesn't really seem to be about a name or copyright. To me, it's way more than that. It seems like it was about quashing the competition. Here's what happened. NCSA licensed its Mosaic browser to a software company called Spyglass. Spyglass was an offshoot of NCSA that commercialized technologies developed by the university's research arms. Spyglass was also positioned as a rival to the new company that Marc Andreessen was creating. This is a battle that, to this day, regardless of all of his incredible successes, Marc Andreessen has not forgotten. This is how Marc described what happened on his podcast.
They didn't sue us because they didn't have a good claim, because we weren't actually violating copyright, and the trademark, you could just change the name. So they didn't actually have a good legal case to sue us. And so instead of suing us, what they did instead was they called Spyglass. Any situation we were in where we were competing with Spyglass for a sale, the University of Illinois administrators would call the customer and tell them that they were going to sue us.
Good Lord. Which is like a thing to do to a startup. That's like the dirtiest thing you can do to a startup.
It's just like a super nefarious, because who wants to, any big company doesn't, is already kind of, worried about doing business with the startup to start with. And if the startup's literally about to get sued, why take the risk? And so our whole sales pipeline froze up. And, we're running on venture capital, and money's getting, and so we don't have that, so not, VC wasn't in those days what it is today. We didn't have that long of a runway. And so we needed revenue. And so this became a big problem. And so we kind of got everybody together and talked about it. And so we then decided, and I'm very proud of this decision. We preemptively sued the University of Illinois on this case, and we sued them for sort of interference with trade. There's these sort of laws that are not great laws to sue on, but they worked in this case, which is this thing called tortious interference. You can in theory it's illegal to just gratuitously interfere in somebody else's business, try to unhook other people's contracts. It's not great law. It doesn't often get enforced, but at least it is on the books. And so we sued Illinois. A furious negotiation followed. We offered them at the time $4 million worth of stock in the company, when the company was worth, I don't know, 20 million or something. For those of you youngsters, it eventually sold for 10 billion. So you can do that math.
Yeah. Rashid Bashir, dean of the Granger College of Engineering, wrote in response to Marc's comments, quote, "We are immensely proud to call Marc Andreessen an alumnus of the Seibel School of Computing and Data Science and the Granger College of Engineering at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. The university regrets the interactions between him and the university administration that happened when he was a student at Illinois. Marc Andreessen embodies the Illinois spirit of innovation, and he remains an inspiration for our students, faculty, and staff. He is a pioneer in technology and entrepreneurship, and while at Illinois, he paved the way for many more founders, inventors, and innovators. We are proud of what he has accomplished to change the world for the better, and we hope to build a brighter future in partnership with him," unquote. This case was settled just before Christmas of 1994, but to this day, that cost the University of Illinois a lot of future income.
Yeah, so it was a billion, it was $1 billion plus, or some depending on exactly what, but it would have been a lot of money. And they turned that down, and instead they demanded cash. And so
one thing you didn't have.
We didn't have, although we at that point it was starting to work, and so we raised money from Kleiner Perkins, and we had other investor interest, and so we had sales starting to come in, and so we paid them the cash and did the settlement, and got them off our backs. That decision on their part, cost them at least $1 billion in direct stock, plus all the downstream philanthropy from me, plus all the downstream philanthropy from Jim Clark, plus all the other founding engineers.
Beyond the copyright of the name, beyond the money, the real battles, like it has been so many times in this world, were about credit. There was the claim Kim Stevenson mentioned from December 1992, when Marc Andreessen stayed at college over Christmas break and created the original Mosaic browser, all by himself. Then there was another battle for credit in 1994 between NCSA and Mark's team of engineers who left NCSA to join him at Netscape. They were facing accusations that they just lifted the code from NCSA and marched it right over to Netscape. This is how Chris Haug, who followed Mark to Netscape from NCSA, remembers it.
Not everyone believes that. I lost some friends who stayed at NCSA over that question. We would talk about it, and it was clear they just flat out didn't believe me. They thought I was lying to them when I was saying, no, we didn't take the code. We started over. There was a ton of bad blood from that. It took a long time. And, we had forensic programmers come in and analyze our source and analyze the NCSA source. My memory is that they said, yeah, no, it's clean. It's different. I think they could probably tell, parts were written by the same people. And so I'm sure there were similarities, but we were very clear from day one that we weren't going to take the source. And so that was a source of a lot of bad blood. Anytime U of I would reach out to me through the alumni division, hey, do you want to make a donation? It's like, no, you guys tried to shut us down. We could have done this very nicely. MIT does this all the time. Stanford does this all the time. We could have a great relationship and we would have all been giving you tons of money, but you decided to take us to court. And so, no, there are a lot of moving pieces and there was a lot of places for bad blood to seep in.
In season 1, you'll remember a phrase that was used: success has 1,000 fathers. This is likely true in Netscape's case. Would Mark have ever even started this company if he hadn't first worked at NCSA? Can you disentangle the direct or indirect influence others' code may have had on Netscape's Navigator browser? It's impossible to say. But when it comes to business, it's winner takes all. It doesn't matter if NCSA played a part in Mark's success. Mark was clearly hurt by how they treated him, and after reporting on this for months, I think that's fair. But if NCSA was going to try and cut into Netscape's market share, they had to be beat. Mark was not in the habit of losing. And turning back to the protocol war, he was not about to lose to EIT either. After 2 embarrassing presentations of SSL, Netscape had to step up its game. So they hired a number of people they thought could improve SSL. One of those hires was Taher Al-Gamal. Taher is a native of Egypt who came to Stanford to get his PhD in computer science in 1979. He is now a partner at Evolution Equity Partners, a venture capital firm on University Avenue in Palo Alto. I met up with him at his office. Taher landed at Netscape after seeing Jim Clark at a conference.
I noticed that Jim Clark was giving a presentation. So I said, oh, I know that guy. I'm going to go listen to him. So I went and listened to him, and he was talking about cryptography. He was a professor when I was a grad student, but I actually know a lot more about cryptography than he did because I studied cryptography. I actually wrote a thesis in cryptography. So I went to him afterwards and said, hey, what are you talking about this for? Are you looking for people who actually understand cryptography for real? And ended up becoming a consultant. And then I became the chief scientist at Netscape in early 95.
Taher knew exactly who to hire who could handle critics like Alan eager to rip apart their work. He brought in another cryptographer and Stanford grad named Paul Kocher, who got to work on the next version of SSL.
So we did this crash design project where it was basically a blank slate redesign of kind of what internet security ought to be. We had SSL2 as the starting point, and it was kind of clear that there were a bunch of things that it had to be. It had to be efficient. It had to be backward compatible. It had to be a protocol that could be published for anybody in the world to look at. It had to kind of deal with the reality of export controls at the time. It had to be, in addition to fast, you kind of want to make sure that things fit within the packets. So the internet sends data in packets. So the result of this kind of maybe 3 months process was a document that was published that defined the SSL3 protocol. So compared to a lot of the protocols people were publishing at the time, this was a really straightforward protocol. The thing that I put a lot of thought into at the time was trying to make sure it could evolve, because it was really clear to me that there were lots of things that I knew that I didn't know, and making the protocol able to adapt as people discovered the things that weren't known then. got a lot of my energy.
This new version of SSL was much better than the first two, and that adaptability was part of the reason why. SHTTP didn't have that same quality.
SHTTP was a little bit more like trying to build a specific kind of box for shipping particular kinds of data around, which was highly customized. Contrast where SSL is a bit like the containers that you might put onto a container ship. You can put almost anything into containers and ship it. And by standardizing on what a container is, it means you can build your shipping infrastructure without having to think about the different kinds of things people want to move. And there might be places where that's not optimal. If you're trying to ship around something that's of an irregular shape, maybe the container isn't the most efficient way to do that. But by building the ships and the infrastructure and the knowledge and the scale around something standardized, you get a lot more understanding and adoption and efficiencies. SHTTP, I think, didn't have quite as much, by being less general, I think was less maybe suited to the adapting needs of the internet.
In other words, SSL may not have been perfect, but it was easier to implement. This protocol war is not so different from the protocol war we discussed in Season 1. Remember how internet pioneers Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn won with their TCP/IP protocols over the OSI protocols favored by the Europeans? Some people to this day think that OSI would have created a safer internet for everyone. But the bottom line is, the technology that wins isn't always the better technology.
Even with the OSI TCP, the long term does not exist if the short term doesn't exist. So if you win the short term, you've actually guaranteed that you're going to be somewhere. That's a lesson that we all learn from not just these two examples, from any other example of technology wars. You gotta win the short term. So I've been in cybersecurity since the industry started, and in every single case, the winning technology is the one that's easier to use, not the one that is complete. Because if people don't use something, who cares? It could be a better technology, but it's so hard to use that people just don't use it.
What Taher is talking about is even more important this time now that the internet was commercial. SSL was designed to scale quickly. This may have been a decade or so before Facebook would coin "move fast and break things" as their motto. But that sentiment could easily be used to describe Netscape. Another factor in a tech's startup success was branding. It wasn't enough to have the best tech. It wasn't even enough to have the biggest potential market. You also had to sell yourself. Netscape developed an edge in this department. Roseanne Sino ran PR for Netscape in the 90s. She didn't exactly fit into the nerdy frat boy culture that had developed at Netscape. But Jim Clark knew she was the right person for the job.
It was a very young, hip, that's not the right word at all, because they were total nerds. But it was a young, vibrant company. Jim had let me know that he knew I was gay coming in. He'd known me for a while, and he said, that is not a problem, and we're going to make sure it's a friendly company in that case. Nobody cared. The guys loved me. I had a great time with them. So it was a very much a culture of, if you could bring something to the party, great, come. And it didn't matter who you were, didn't matter what you looked like, and it was about working hard, getting things done quickly, shoving them out into the world and seeing if we could make something.
Her most important and arguably most difficult task was building the public image of Mark Andreessen. While she loved promoting him, she remembers just how uncouth he was, doing things like eating soft-boiled eggs in front of the press and dropping egg bits all over himself. Still, the press loved it.
The very early days, he was, again, a fascinating person to interview for sure. So I was happy to be able to get people in to talk to him because it was clearly like people were blown away. On the other hand, he didn't take direction well at all. He was a young guy who thought he was super smart, and he was, but he thought he knew everything. And so there was a way where keeping him on track, definitely there were times when he drove me nuts. The big story was we finally got a chance to be on TV, which was a great thing. And we had to go to a studio in San Francisco to do the interview. And I told him, we have to get there. I have to pick you up at 6:00. We got to get you over to this interview. And I went to his door and knocked and knocked and knocked and knocked. Finally, he came to the door and he wasn't dressed. And it was like, oh my God. I'm like, throw some clothes on, we gotta go. But this was a kind of a typical thing, like, this sort of feeling like, well, everybody could wait for him, or, it wasn't that big of a deal.
Mark became a star. And if your founder is a star, your company has a better chance of succeeding. It's impossible to disentangle the celebrity attained by founders like Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg from the success of their companies. Maybe Apple and Meta would still be as big as they are with anonymous figureheads. But at the very least, it opened doors. The point is, Netscape pulled every lever they could to get an edge in the market. Plus, Mark would always try to win, at all costs. But back to the battle between SSL and SHTTP. Netscape still had to take one more step in convincing the broader world of computer freaks that they had the better product. Because industry gods like Tim Berners-Lee remained fans of SHTTP. So here's what Jeff Treuhaft said Netscape did to change their minds.
I flew out there with our VP of engineering, Rick Schell, to a meeting in Boston, a W3C meeting, where we were supposed to have a debate about SSL versus SHTTP. And when the meeting started, Tim Berners-Lee decided to start the meeting by asking for a show of hands. And he called this an informal thing afterward, but he asked for a show of hands, how many people wanted SHTTP and how many people wanted SSL. The hand count was largely in favor of SHTTP. Some of those people were standards people, not engineers working on the product.
But the Netscape team was not going to accept that result.
We called Tim Berners-Lee and said, because somebody leaked that there was this vote to the press, that these hands went up and that SHTTP had won. And we said, you're going to issue a retraction that there was no vote on the technology instantly, like in the next few minutes. And if you don't, we're going to issue a press release that we're pulling out of the W3C because we don't think it's a fair standards organization. My recollection of that time is Tim did go ahead and explain to people that there was no formal vote.
SSL and SHTTP were both still in the running to be adopted by W3C and the rest of the standards makers, even though the majority of those decision makers were on the side of EIT's protocol. For Netscape, at least they had more time to make their case, particularly to the OEMs or original equipment manufacturers.
So I stopped going to meetings and I spent with Roseanne Sino's team. I spent a good month or two. In my recollection, it took us about 60 days. We put together a press release announcing that SSL was the most secure and the most widely used security protocol on the internet. And then we went and got 3 to 3.5 pages of quotes from about 20 to 30 businesses, including at the end, all of the OEMs. We saved them until the last, but we got people at Visa and MasterCard. We got people at B of A and Chase Bank. And we basically did a whole phalanx of commercial Fortune 50 companies to agree that SSL was the most secure and most widely used protocol at the time. And then the night before the press release was going to go out, we called Microsoft and offered them a chance to be in the press release. And they finally agreed to be in the press release. And we issued the press release, and that was it. Everybody agreed SSL was the way to go.
On March 20th, 1995, Netscape issued its press release. SSL had won, and even the giant Microsoft, for that brief moment, had to bend to their will. And with that win, EIT's chance to build its own legacy in this protocol war was decimated. But in retrospect, Eric has come to terms with this defeat.
I think the basic reason is that SSL was just a lot simpler. It was simpler to implement, and it was simpler to use. And what I mean by simpler to use is that all you had to do was pull up this secure channel, and then you could anything you wanted, you didn't think about it at all. Okay. And that was a design consideration for them, was this has got to be like dead simple to use. We had a lot of ideas about how complicated people want things to be and how flexible we want them to be. What's ironic is, now from the perspective of 2024, you see people doing a lot of the things we were doing in Security HTTP and trying to retrofit them into the existing infrastructure. So you see, so Security HTTP, as I said, each message was like individually signed or individually encrypted, right? And so now you see people doing encryption and signing for HTTP messages individually. But if you want to get something done, from the perspective of 1994 or 95, and you want to get it right away, I think they were clearly right and we were clearly wrong.
Beyond cementing Netscape's dominance in Silicon Valley, this coup also reflected the shift in power that was taking place with the growth of the internet. The commercial world now dominated. It wasn't the academics calling the shots or the Department of Defense. It was Fortune 500 companies and VCs. By August of 1995, Netscape would go public. The company founded not even 2 years earlier would achieve a market cap of roughly $3 billion by close of its first day on the stock exchange. Just about every source I talked to for this season of Computer Freaks points to August 9th, 1995, the day Netscape went public, as one of the most important dates in the history of the internet. It's not like there weren't hugely successful tech companies before this. Microsoft was a multi-billion-dollar company, but this opened the floodgates. In 1995, there was $7.6 billion of venture capital investment in the U.S. By 2000, that number was just shy of $100 billion. That IPO changed the tech world, and it certainly changed the lives of everyone who worked at Netscape. Here's how Taher El-Gamal remembers that day at Netscape.
The entire company was in the office at 6 o'clock in the morning. Every single person. Because the company was still very young, and all of a sudden we're doing IPO, and everybody's looking, really? And it was a crazy thing, and it did change a lot. It changed the industry, that's for sure.
As Taher sits with me and my producer Josh in the conference room of his serene downtown Palo Alto office, he can definitely draw a line from the Netscape IPO to the world of Silicon Valley today. How did it change your life?
It changed my life in every possible way. I became known in the industry is the number one thing, because Netscape was so visible. And here's a chief scientist, running around doing security stuff. But financially, it was very successful. The network of the ex-Netscape people here is incredible. Everybody's gone on to do a lot of different successful things. So the team was just unbelievable.
How did it change you financially? I mean, you hear about a lot of Netscape stories.
I went in pre-IPO and I survived through the IPO. It's just as simple as that. I mean, all the companies now, how on earth does somebody afford to buy a house in Palo Alto today?
I don't know.
Through the IPOs. It's the only way. Because there's nobody's going to make enough salary anywhere to carry a mortgage for a $5 million home.
Apparently, Marc Andreessen slept through the company going public. But when the then 24-year-old woke up at 11 a.m. Pacific time, he was worth $58 million. All of the kids Marc had brought from NCSA were now also multimillionaires. By February 1996, Time magazine put Marc Andreessen on its cover under the headline Golden Geeks. It's not clear in the photo if he's yawning or snarling at you, but there's definitely a hint of a smile. But that moment didn't just benefit Marc Andreessen and the rest of the computer freaks at Netscape. The tide rose for all of the tech companies.
That just kicked off like a gold rush that everyone suddenly knew this is a way to get rich and this is a way to be famous. And it changed the world both in terms of like, actually, here was the first time someone really made a business on the internet. And also they really did something like that had like significance, but I think even more like it changed the cultural world and that people suddenly was like, oh, this is like something, an opportunity to like really be a successful person as opposed to sort of being a nerd who kind of likes to work in computers.
This is a huge break from the world that Marty Tannenbaum and Alan Schiffman started in. Suddenly, tech companies weren't toiling over writing elaborate contracts for the Department of Defense because no lender would give their work the time of day. When I spoke with Marty, he could not emphasize enough how different this was. He kept telling me a story about a conversation he had with this guy, Bill Davidow, who was a known venture capitalist in Silicon Valley.
There was no money being invested in the internet short of what we got from places like DARPA. I wanted to get VC money. I talked to the VCs. They had no interest in investing in something I told you, I think, and I'll say it for the record here, one of the brightest VCs from that period, and maybe ever, was a guy named Bill Davidow. He was the genius who created the Intel Inside campaign and marketing. And then he went off and started Moore Davidow as a VC firm. And I spent hours with Bill saying, we'd like to build EIT into a real company, and I'd like to raise the money to do that. And would you be willing to support us? And Bill met with me multiple times, brought reams of yellow pads that he would fill, legal pads, right? He would fill them full of everything we talked about. And what we talked about was exactly laying out how this is going to play out, how you're going to have on the sides of buses URLs that are going to say like furniture.com or what have you, and how these companies would be able to build on each other's services. So someone would be able to integrate a shipping company and a payments firm and whatever and create a virtual company that did nothing more than kind of what Amazon does today, which is they allow third parties to be able to sell on their platform. This model that we laid out to the world, and not all of it has happened, some of it not even yet today.
But he wouldn't put any money into it.
More interesting than that was what he told me. He's looking at all these pads and so forth, scratches his head and says, there's got to be a pony in there somewhere. But how can you make money off of something that no one owns? That's a quote. And the answer was that he and everyone else figured it out when Netscape went public in 95 and shot up on its first day.
I reached out to Bill Davidow and his company to give him the chance to respond. He wrote in an email, quote, all of this is a long time ago, especially when you reach my age. As an investor, I always want to understand the business model. Your guess at what a business will be worth is based on the model. My problem with investing early was in the internet is that I had little confidence in the business models, so I could not tell if I was getting a good or bad deal, unquote. That same month that Netscape went public, EIT made its own deal, but it was far less lucrative. It sold to Verifone for just $28 million. What I've learned from talking to my computer freaks for the past 3 years is that success has a lot to do with timing. This is something that reminds me of my dad. Growing up as he sat in countless dinner parties talking about how we should worry about things like climate change. And in the 1980s, he was talking about how someday we would be doing everything in life on our phones. Ideas that frankly embarrassed my mom and left some awkward chuckles from guests. If you're too far ahead of the curve in your thinking and your asks, they're not going to be well received. This may be the case for EIT. Were they slightly too soon trying to push e-commerce? What if Mark Andreessen had dropped out of NCSA, just like Bill Gates had dropped out and never came to EIT in 1994? What if Jim Clark hadn't fallen out with Silicon Graphics and never met Mark? What if SHTTP won over SSL? Would EIT be the billion-dollar company that changed Silicon Valley instead of Netscape? I guess we'll never know. Computer Freaks is created and hosted by myself, Christine Hani Dare-Bryan. Our executive producer and editor is Josh Christensen. Producers are Miriam Kiparawidze and Taka Zen. Production support from Blake Odom, Matt Toder, and Avery Miles. Music by James Jackman. Sound design and mixing by Nicholas Torres. Fact-checking by Mark Amudsum. Special thanks to Stephanie Mehta, Mike Hoffman, and Michelle Legro. And I dedicate Computer Freaks Season 2 to my dad, Major Joseph Hani.